A woman marries a caged stranger to save him from hanging, but the town swears she's just signed her own death warrant. Stay with me until the end of this story. You won't believe what happens when compassion collides with frontier justice and a silent man carrying unimaginable grief. Hit that like button now and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this tale travels across the world. Because what you're about to hear isn't just about survival in the American wilderness. It's about two broken souls who refuse to let fear write their ending. The stagecoach lurched to a stop, throwing Mabel Turner forward against the worn leather seat. Dust bloomed through the window gaps, coating her already filthy traveling dress with another layer of Colorado grit. 3 weeks on the road from Missouri, and she'd arrived at last. Black Hollow. The name had sounded romantic in the letters. Her intended groom, Thomas Whitmore, had written about mountain views and fertile land, about a cabin waiting and a future they'd build together. His penmanship had been careful, his promises specific. A mail-order arrangement, yes, but he'd seemed genuine, decent. And after what Mabel had survived back east, decent was all she dared hope for. She gathered her carpet bag and stepped down onto the rutted street, her boots sinking slightly into mud still damp from yesterday's rain. The town spread before her in the harsh afternoon light, a collection of weathered buildings clinging to the mountainside like barnacles on a ship's hull. A general store, a saloon with a crooked sign, a church with white paint peeling in long strips, and in the center of the square something that made her stomach clench, an iron cage. Not a jail, not a proper holding cell with walls and a roof, just a cage, like something you'd keep an animal in, sitting exposed to the elements in full view of anyone passing by. Inside sat a man. Mabel's first impression was of size, broad shoulders hunched forward, long legs drawn up because the cage wasn't tall enough for him to stand. His clothes were torn and stained, his dark hair hanging past his jaw in matted tangles. Chains wrapped around his wrists, the kind of heavy iron meant for the most dangerous prisoners. But it was his stillness that struck her hardest. He didn't pace or rattle the bars or shout. He simply sat, head bowed, breathing, existing, as if he'd accepted whatever fate the town had decided for him. A small crowd had gathered near the cage, mostly men, their voices carrying across the square in rough fragments. Should have strung him up already. Waiting on Judge Morrison, but hell, we all know what he did. Caves full of bones, I heard, human bones. Mabel tore her gaze away and looked around for someone official. The stage driver had already started unloading luggage, and a boy of maybe 12 appeared at her elbow. Need help with your bags, ma'am? I'm looking for Thomas Whitmore, Mabel said. Can you direct me to his property? The boy's face went strange. Not quite pity, not quite amusement. Something uncomfortable in between. Whitmore's gone, ma'am. Gone where? Just gone. Left about 2 months back. Sold what he could, abandoned the rest. Lit out for California, or so folks say. The words hit like a physical blow. Mabel's hand tightened on her bag's handle. That's not possible. I received a letter from him just 6 weeks ago. He was expecting me. We had an agreement. The boy shrugged with the carelessness of youth. Don't know about letters, ma'am. I just know his cabin's empty and his land claim sitting unclaimed. Sheriff might know more. He pointed toward a squat building with bars on the windows, then scampered off to help another passenger. Mabel stood frozen in the street, feeling the weight of 3 weeks' travel and every hope she'd carried collapsing into ash. She'd sold everything she owned back in Missouri, spent her last dollars on the stage fare. Come all this way on the strength of promises written in careful script, and Thomas Whitmore had simply vanished. Around her, the town continued its business. A woman emerged from the general store carrying a basket of supplies. 2 men argued over a poker debt outside the saloon. Life moved forward, indifferent to one abandoned bride standing in the mud. Mabel forced herself to breathe. She'd survived worse than this. After Henry died, murdered by men who'd never faced justice, killed for a debt he didn't owe, she'd rebuilt her life from nothing. She'd worked as a seamstress, a laundress, a cook. She'd endured whispers and pitying looks and men who thought a widow was easy prey. She could survive this too. First step, find the sheriff, get answers, figure out what happened to the land claim and whether she had any legal recourse. She crossed the square, giving the cage a wide berth. But as she passed, something made her glance back. The prisoner had lifted his head. Storm gray eyes met hers through the bars. Not pleading, not threatening, just looking. Seeing her the way she'd looked at him, as another human being in a place that seemed determined to strip away humanity. Then he lowered his gaze again, and Mabel continued toward the sheriff's office. The interior was dim and smelled of tobacco and old coffee. A man sat behind a desk, his silver star pinned to a vest that strained over a substantial belly. He looked up as she entered, his expression shifting through surprise and something that might have been annoyance. "Help you, ma'am?" "I'm Mabel Turner. I came to marry Thomas Whitmore. I'm told he's left town." The sheriff, Murphy, according to the nameplate on his desk, leaned back in his chair with a creak of wood and springs. "That's right. Took off about 8 weeks back. Didn't leave a forwarding address. He wrote to me 6 weeks ago." Murphy shrugged. "Can't speak to that. Maybe he wrote before he left. Maybe someone else wrote using his name. Either way, he's gone." Mabel felt her jaw tighten. "What about his land claim? His property? Reverted to open claim when he abandoned it. You want to file for it yourself? You can try, but there's procedures, fees, and being a woman." He paused, choosing his words. "Well, you'd need a husband to make it legal. That's just how the territory works." Of course it was. Mabel had learned long ago that the law bent different ways depending on who you were. She took a breath, steadying herself. "Is there a boarding house? Somewhere I can stay while I sort this out?" "Mrs. Chen runs rooms above the restaurant. Not fancy, but clean enough." Murphy pulled out a pocket watch, glanced at it, then stood. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got business to attend to." "The man in the cage," Mabel heard herself say. "What did he do?" Murphy's face hardened. "That's Silas Crow. Killed a good man named Jacob Hendricks about 3 months back. Beat him to death up in the mountain passes. We found Jacob's body, found Crow's camp nearby with Jacob's belongings. Open and shut. Has he had a trial?" "Trial's coming. Judge Morrison circuits through every few months. He'll be here next week, and Crow will hang the day after. Justice delayed, maybe, but justice all the same." Something in Murphy's tone made Mabel's spine stiffen. She'd heard that kind of certainty before. The same confidence the Missouri sheriff had shown when he'd called Henry's murder a business dispute gone wrong and refused to investigate further. "Did he confess?" "Hasn't said a word since we brought him in, but evidence speaks for itself." "Evidence can be misread." Murphy's eyes narrowed. "You just got here, ma'am. You don't know this town or its people. Jacob Hendricks was respected. Silas Crow's been living like an animal in those mountains for years. When a good man turns up dead and a wild man's nearby with stolen property, it doesn't take a genius to figure out what happened." "But you haven't actually proven—" "Ma'am," Murphy's voice went flat. "I appreciate you've had a difficult journey, but you do well not to make it worse by questioning things you don't understand. Now I really do have business to attend to." He moved past her toward the door, effectively ending the conversation. Mabel stood in the empty office for a moment, fury and exhaustion warring in her chest. She'd crossed half a continent for nothing. Her money was gone, her future uncertain, and she was stranded in a town that had already decided she should mind her own business and accept how things worked. Well, she'd never been particularly good at accepting things. Mabel found Mrs. Chen's restaurant easily enough, the only building with actual curtains in the windows and a menu board outside. The proprietor was a tiny Chinese woman with sharp eyes and competent hands who took one look at Mabel and seemed to understand the whole situation without asking. "Whitmore bride," she said. Not a question. "Former Whitmore bride," Mabel corrected. "He was a fool and a coward. Left debts all over town." Mrs. Chen waved her upstairs. "Room's $2 a week, includes breakfast. Dinner's extra if you want it." The room was small but scrupulously clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the square. Mabel set down her bag and sank onto the mattress, allowing herself exactly 1 minute of despair. Then she stood up, washed her face in the basin, and started planning. She had maybe $20 left, enough for 10 weeks of rent if she was careful, less if she ate. She'd need work, which meant convincing someone in this town to hire a strange woman with no references and no husband. The sound of voices drew her to the window. A crowd had gathered around the cage again, larger than before. Men mostly, but a few women too, and even some children. They formed a rough semicircle, keeping a few feet back, as if the prisoner might reach through the bars and grab them. Sheriff Murphy stood near the front, arms crossed. "Y'all know why we're here," he announced. "Circuit judge arrives in 6 days. Trial happens the day after. But I want it understood. This town don't tolerate murder. Silas Crow killed Jacob Hendricks in cold blood, and he'll answer for it." Someone in the crowd shouted agreement. Others joined in, a chorus of anger and satisfaction. The prisoner, Silas Crow, remained motionless. He sat exactly as he had before, head bowed, chains resting in his lap. If he heard the accusations, he gave no sign. "Found him living in caves like an animal," Murphy continued. "Found bones scattered around his camps, old graves dug up. He's been preying on travelers for years, most like. And Jacob Hendricks was just the first one we could prove." "Hang him now!" someone yelled. "No." Murphy raised a hand. "We'll do this legal. Judge Morrison will hear the case, and then we'll carry out proper sentencing. But make no mistake, justice is coming." The crowd roared approval. Mabel watched from her window, that familiar sick feeling rising in her throat. She'd seen this before. Not in Colorado, but in Missouri. Different players, same performance. A crowd deciding guilt before any trial happened, whipping themselves into righteous fury. Henry had died because men decided he was guilty of debt and didn't deserve a chance to explain. They'd beaten him in an alley behind the factory where he worked, and the sheriff had ruled it an accident. An unfortunate confrontation. Boys will be boys. The killers had walked free. And Mabel had learned that justice was something you had to fight for, not something that arrived on its own. She pulled on her shawl and headed back downstairs. Mrs. Chen was chopping vegetables in the kitchen. She looked up as Mabel passed. "You're going out there." "Just want to see for myself." "Waste of time. That man's as good as dead." "Maybe," Mabel said, "but I'll decide for myself what I think." She crossed the square slowly, taking in details. The cage was homemade, welded from rough iron bars that didn't quite line up evenly. No shelter from sun or rain, no blanket, no bed, just bare ground and the chains and the man. Up close, Silas Crow looked even worse. His face was bruised, probably from when they'd captured him. His clothes were torn in several places, but his hands caught Mabel's attention. Large hands, scarred and calloused, but not from fighting. These were working hands, builders' hands. The crowd had dispersed after Murphy's speech, leaving only a few lingerers. One of them, an older woman in a faded dress, noticed Mabel staring. "Wouldn't get too close if I were you," the woman said. "He's dangerous." "Has he hurt anyone while he's been in there?" "Well, no, but has he threatened anyone? Made any trouble?" The woman frowned. "He don't talk, just sits there like a beast. But that don't mean he ain't dangerous." "You heard what the sheriff said. He killed Jacob Hendricks." "I heard the accusation," Mabel said carefully. "I haven't heard his side." "His side?" The woman laughed, harsh and brittle. "There ain't no his side to murder, honey. And even if there was, he won't speak. Hasn't said a word to anyone. Guilty conscience, if you ask me." She walked away, shaking her head. Mabel stood alone by the cage. After a moment, she spoke. "Can you hear me?" No response. The man's head remained bowed. "My name is Mabel Turner. I just arrived in town. I'm trying to understand what happened here." Still nothing. "Did you kill Jacob Hendricks?" For a long moment, silence. Then slowly, Silas Crow lifted his head. Those gray eyes found hers again. Up close, she could see they were red-rimmed from exhaustion or weeping or both. His face was gaunt, cheekbones standing out sharp beneath skin burned dark by mountain sun. He held her gaze for 3 heartbeats, then he gave a single precise shake of his head. No. Something in Mabel's chest tightened. Maybe he was lying. Maybe this was manipulation, but the look in his eyes wasn't cunning or calculated. It was just tired. Bone deep, soul sick, tired. "Will you tell them what really happened?" He looked away. "Why won't you speak?" A muscle worked in his jaw. For a second she thought he might answer. Then he tucked his head down again, retreating into silence. Mabel stood there a moment longer, thinking. Then she returned to Mrs. Chen's restaurant. Over the next 3 days, Mabel learned everything she could about Black Hollow and its recent history. Jacob Hendricks, she learned, had been a rancher with property north of town. Successful, respected, active in the church. He'd disappeared 3 months ago while checking his northern grazing lands. When he didn't return, a search party went looking. They found his body in a mountain pass, badly beaten. His horse, his rifle, and his saddlebags were missing. A week later, they found Silas Crow's camp in a canyon 5 miles away. Jacob's belongings were there, the saddlebags, the rifle, everything. They arrested Crow on the spot, open and shut, like Murphy said. Except the more Mabel talked to people, the more inconsistencies emerged. Silas used to come to town sometimes, the blacksmith told her. Years back, before he went fully wild. Bought supplies, kept to himself. Never caused trouble. I seen him help a family whose wagon broke down, an old-timer at the saloon admitted. Fixed their axle, wouldn't take payment. That was maybe 4 years ago. He's been living rough for a long time, Mrs. Chen said, since before I came to Black Hollow. Something happened to him, broke him, but I never heard of him hurting anyone. Yet the story the town had settled on was clear. Silas Crow was a violent hermit who'd killed a good man for his belongings. On the 4th day, Mabel watched a group of boys throw stones at the cage. "Monster!" one yelled, landing a rock that clanged against the bars. "Murderer!" shouted another. Silas didn't react. He sat with his back against the far side of the cage, eyes closed, breathing steady despite the impacts. A stone caught him on the shoulder. He didn't flinch. Mabel strode across the square. "Stop that! Right now!" The boys turned, startled by her sharp tone. "He's a killer, lady," the oldest one said, maybe 14. "Sheriff said so." "The sheriff said he's accused. There's a difference. Now get out of here before I tell your mothers what you've been doing." They scattered, grumbling but going. Mabel turned to find Silas looking at her through the bars. His expression was unreadable, but something flickered in those gray eyes. Recognition, maybe, or surprise that anyone had intervened. "You hurt?" Mabel asked. He touched his shoulder where the stone had hit, then shook his head slightly. "Fine." "You need to defend yourself," Mabel said. "Tell them what really happened." He just looked at her, and she saw something she recognized from her own mirror in the months after Henry died. Not defiance, not surrender, just profound exhaustion with the whole business of being alive. He'd given up. That night, Mabel lay in her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling. Her money was running low. She'd found no work. Every shop and business she'd approached had politely declined. A woman alone, no husband, no family in town. Too complicated. Too risky. In 6 days, Judge Morrison would arrive. The trial would be a formality. Silas Crow would hang. And maybe he deserved it. Maybe he really had killed Jacob Hendricks. Mabel had no proof otherwise, just a feeling in her gut and a man's silent denial. But she kept thinking about Henry, about how the Missouri sheriff had been so certain, so confident in his version of events, about how easy it was for a town to decide someone was guilty and then find evidence to match. About how no one had stood up for her husband because standing up meant going against the crowd. She rose before dawn and dressed carefully. Her best dress, which wasn't saying much after 3 weeks on the road, and her mother's cameo brooch. She pinned up her hair, studying herself in the small mirror. A plus-size woman in her 30s, plain-faced and practical. Not the kind of woman who turned heads or inspired songs. But Henry had loved her anyway, and she'd loved him back. And that had been enough until men with clubs had taken him away. She wasn't going to let it happen again. Not if she could help it. The square was empty when she crossed it. Silas was awake, sitting against the bars with his knees drawn up. He watched her approach with wary eyes. "I'm going to do something," Mabel said without preamble. "Something that's probably insane. But I need to know first, did you kill Jacob Hendricks?" He shook his head. "No." "Do you know who did?" A pause, then a slight nod. "Yes." "Will you tell me?" He looked away. "All right," Mabel said. "Here's what I think. I think Jacob Hendricks came after you for some reason. I think there was a fight, and maybe he died, or maybe someone else killed him. I think you're protecting someone or something, and you've decided dying is easier than talking." Silas's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. "Well, I'm not going to let you die without a fight, so you can cooperate or not, but either way, I'm doing this." She turned and marched toward the sheriff's office. Murphy was drinking coffee when she entered. He sighed at the sight of her. "Miss Turner, what can I do for you at this ungodly hour?" "I want to marry Silas Crow." The sheriff choked on his coffee. "You what?" I want to marry him. Today, if possible, before the judge arrives. Murphy set down his cup very carefully. Ma'am, I don't know what kind of joke this is. It's not a joke. I came to Black Hollow to marry. My intended groom abandoned me. I need a husband to claim the land he left behind. Silas Crow needs an advocate. This solves both problems. That man is a murderer. That man is accused. He hasn't been tried or convicted. Until he is, he has the right to marry if he chooses. He won't choose. He doesn't even talk. Then I'll ask him. If he refuses, that's the end of it. But if he accepts, Mabel pulled the last thing of value she owned from her pocket, her mother's gold wedding band. You have to allow it. Territorial law permits it. Murphy stared at her like she'd grown a second head. You're out of your mind. Maybe, but I'm also right about the law. Check if you want. He did check, pulling out a thick book of territorial statutes and flipping through with increasing frustration. Finally, he slammed it shut. Legal doesn't mean sane, but that man's going to hang. If he's guilty, yes. But if there's any chance he's innocent, he deserves someone in his corner. I'll take responsibility for him. If he harms anyone, I'll bear the consequences. You'll bear them all right. You'll be a widow within a week. I've been a widow before, Mabel said quietly. I survived it. Murphy studied her for a long moment. Then he shook his head. Your funeral. I'll fetch the clerk. The clerk was a nervous man named Patterson, who clearly thought everyone involved had lost their minds. He brought the necessary papers to the square, where a crowd had already gathered, drawn by rumors of something strange happening. Mabel stood before the cage while Patterson fumbled with the documents. Silas Crow, she said clearly, I'm offering you marriage. If you accept, I'll stand with you at the trial. I'll fight for your life. But you have to agree. Nod if you understand. He stared at her through the bars. The crowd murmured, disbelieving. She's crazy, someone muttered. He'll kill her first chance he gets, another voice predicted. Silas's gaze never left Mabel's face. She saw him weighing it. Marriage to a stranger versus dying alone and unmourned. Saw the moment he decided anything was better than nothing. He nodded. Get him out of there, Mabel told Murphy. The hell I will. He stays chained. Then we'll marry with him chained, but you're opening that cage. Murphy's face reddened, but an elderly man stepped forward from the crowd, tall and rail-thin, with white hair and the bearing of someone used to authority. Let him out, Sheriff. The lady's within her rights. Judge Morrison, I said let him out. We'll keep the chains on if it makes you feel better. But a wedding in a cage is unseemly. So that was Judge Morrison, arrived early. Murphy looked like he wanted to argue, but he unlocked the cage with shaking hands. Silas unfolded himself slowly, standing for the first time in days. He was taller than Mabel had realized, 6 feet at least, broad through the shoulders despite obvious malnourishment. The chains on his wrists hung heavy, and he moved stiffly, every muscle protesting, but he stood. Patterson cleared his throat. Do you, Silas Crow, take this woman as your lawfully wedded wife? Silas looked at Mabel. Up close she could see a scar through his left eyebrow, old but deep. Could see the way his hands shook slightly, not from fear but from exhaustion and poor treatment. He nodded. Verbal consent is required, Patterson said nervously. For a moment Mabel thought he wouldn't speak, that this whole thing would collapse because he refused to break his silence. Then Silas drew a breath. Yes. His voice came out rough and cracked from disuse, barely above a whisper. I do. The crowd gasped. Even Murphy looked startled. And do you, Mabel Turner, take this man? I do, Mabel said firmly, before Patterson could finish. She slipped her mother's ring onto Silas's finger. His hands were too large for it to fit properly, but it settled at the base of his pinky, gold against scarred skin. Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado, Patterson said weakly, I pronounce you man and wife. The crowd erupted into chaos. Women shrieked that Mabel had signed her death warrant. Men shouted that she was a fool. Children stared wide-eyed at the spectacle. Judge Morrison raised his hands for quiet. The marriage is legal and binding. Sheriff Murphy, you will release Mr. Crow into his wife's custody pending trial. He is not to leave town, and Mrs. Crow will be held responsible for his conduct. Your Honor, this is my decision, Sheriff. Release him. Murphy looked mutinous, but he unlocked the chains. They fell away from Silas's wrists, leaving raw marks beneath. He stood there, free for the first time in weeks, and seemed unsure what to do with his hands. Mabel stepped close, pitching her voice low enough that only he could hear. "Can you walk? We need to leave before they change their minds." He nodded. "Then let's go." She turned and started across the square, and after a heartbeat's hesitation, Silas followed. Behind them, the crowd murmured threats and predictions of disaster. Ahead lay the mountains, vast and indifferent. And between them walked a mail-order bride who'd been abandoned and a silent man accused of murder, bound together by desperate circumstance and a marriage neither had expected to survive. Mabel didn't look back. She'd made her choice. Right or wrong, sane or foolish, she'd stood against a town's certainty and claimed a stranger as her husband. Now she just had to figure out what came next. They made it 3 blocks before Mabel realized she had no idea where they were going. Her room at Mrs. Chen's was barely large enough for one person, and bringing Silas there would cause an uproar that might get them both thrown out. The abandoned Whitmore property was miles outside town, and she wasn't even sure she could find it without directions. Every eye in Black Hollow was watching them, waiting for the moment this reckless decision would collapse into violence or scandal. Silas walked beside her in silence, his stride uneven after days of confinement. He kept his hands loose at his sides, but Mabel noticed how his gaze swept constantly. Doorways, windows, alleys. A man expecting trouble. "Do you have anywhere to go?" she asked quietly. "Somewhere in town we could stay?" He shook his head. "The mountains, then. Your camp." A longer pause, then a slight nod. "How far?" He held up 5 fingers, then pointed northeast toward the peaks. 5 miles? Another nod. Mabel's practical side kicked in immediately. 5 miles through mountain terrain, and she was wearing town shoes with thin soles already worn from travel. She had no supplies, no food, no blankets. Night would fall in a few hours, and Colorado nights got cold even in late spring. But staying in Black Hollow meant facing the town's anger. And Mabel had learned long ago that angry crowds didn't calm down. They escalated. Better to leave now and figure out the details later. "We need supplies first," she said. "Wait here." She left him standing in the shadow of the livery stable and headed back to Mrs. Chen's restaurant. The proprietor was sweeping the front steps, her expression unreadable. "You married him," Mrs. Chen said, not a question. "I did. People are saying you've lost your mind." "People said the same thing when I left Missouri." Mabel climbed the stairs to her room. "I need to collect my things. I'll pay what I owe for the days I stayed." Mrs. Chen followed her up. "Where will you go?" "His camp, in the mountains." "Alone? With a man accused of murder?" Mabel pulled her carpet bag from under the bed and started packing the few belongings she'd unpacked. "He didn't do it." "You don't know that. I know what a guilty man looks like. And I know what an innocent man looks like when the world's decided he's guilty anyway." She turned to face Mrs. Chen. "My husband back in Missouri was beaten to death in an alley. The law called it an accident. The men who killed him walked free because nobody wanted to make trouble. So yes, maybe I'm wrong about Silas Crow. But I'd rather be wrong trying to help than right doing nothing." Mrs. Chen was quiet for a moment. Then she sighed. "Wait here." She disappeared downstairs and returned carrying a bundle wrapped in cloth. "Bread, dried meat, some apples. It's not much, but it'll keep you from starving tonight." Mabel's throat tightened. "I can't pay you for this." "I'm not asking you to, just—" Mrs. Chen hesitated. "Be careful. If you're wrong about him, you'll be alone in those mountains with no one to help you. And if I'm right, he'll have at least one person who didn't abandon him to die." She finished packing and counted out coins for the room. Mrs. Chen waved them away. "Keep it. You'll need every penny." Mabel wanted to argue, but practicality won. She accepted the kindness with a nod of thanks and headed back to the livery. Silas was exactly where she'd left him, standing motionless in the shadows. He looked at the bag over her shoulder, then at the food bundle, and something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, or suspicion that anyone would help him. "Can you carry this?" Mabel held out the food bundle. He took it carefully, as if afraid it might vanish if he grabbed too fast. "Lead the way," Mabel said. They left Black Hollow with the sun already sliding toward the western peaks. Silas set a steady pace, not fast but relentless, following paths that weren't quite paths. game trails and creek beds and stretches of bare rock where Mabel had to watch her footing. He didn't speak, didn't look back to check if she was keeping up, just walked, and Mabel followed, concentrating on not twisting an ankle. After an hour, her legs were burning and her lungs struggled with the thin mountain air. Silas finally stopped beside a stream, gesturing for her to rest. She sank onto a flat rock gratefully while he knelt and drank from cupped hands. "How much further?" she asked. He held up 3 fingers. 3 miles! Mabel bit back a groan. Her feet were already blistering, and the light was fading fast. Silas stood and held out his hand. She stared at it, then at him. His face was neutral, but the offer was clear. Help if she needed it. "I can walk," Mabel said. He didn't lower his hand. She took it. His palm was rough with calluses, his grip careful despite the strength she could feel beneath. He pulled her upright, and they continued. The terrain grew rougher. Trees gave way to broken granite and sparse scrub. The path, if it could be called that, climbed steadily, switching back and forth across the mountainside. Mabel's breath came harsh and ragged, but Silas never complained about her pace. He simply adjusted his stride to match hers. Full dark had fallen by the time they reached his camp. It wasn't what Mabel had expected. The town's whispers had painted images of caves filled with bones and chaos. But what she saw in the dying light was simply a shelter. Tucked into a cleft between 2 massive boulders, protected from wind and weather. A fire ring made of carefully placed stones. A lean-to built from branches and bark. Everything organized, purposeful. Silas built a fire without speaking, coaxing flame from flint and dried grass with the ease of long practice. The light pushed back the darkness, and Mabel finally got a good look at the camp. Simple didn't mean primitive. Tools hung from branches in tidy rows, knives, an axe, what looked like metalworking implements, a stack of cut firewood protected from rain by a piece of canvas, a water skin hanging from a branch, and everywhere little signs of craft, a bowl carved from a single piece of wood, smoothed and oiled, pegs driven into the rock face to hang things, a small forge built into the mountainside itself. "You made all this?" Mabel asked. Silas glanced at her, then nodded. "How long have you lived here?" He held up both hands, then showed 4 fingers. 14 years, maybe? Or 4 seasons? Mabel wasn't sure, but the camp spoke of time and effort. She sat on a log near the fire while Silas unwrapped Mrs. Chen's bundle. He divided the food precisely in half, offering Mabel her portion on a flat piece of bark that served as a plate. "Thank you," she said. He ducked his head in acknowledgement and retreated to the far side of the fire. They ate in silence. The bread was good, the dried meat tough, but flavorful. Mabel's stomach, which had been tight with anxiety all day, finally began to settle. Around them, the mountain breathed. Wind through pine branches, distant calls of nightbirds, the occasional scrabble of small animals in the underbrush. When the food was gone, Silas fetched a blanket from inside the lean-to and offered it to her. "What about you?" Mabel asked. He shook his head and pointed to himself, then to the ground near the fire. He'd sleep outside. "That's ridiculous. It's your camp." He stood there holding the blanket, clearly not planning to argue, but equally clearly not planning to take the shelter while she slept exposed. "We'll share," Mabel decided. "The lean-to's big enough for 2 people if we're not precious about it." Silas looked uncomfortable with that idea, but Mabel was too tired to care about propriety. She took the blanket and crawled into the shelter. It smelled of pine and smoke and honest sweat, not unpleasant. The floor was covered with soft needles and moss, more comfortable than she'd expected. After a moment's hesitation, Silas followed. He settled near the entrance as far from Mabel as the small space allowed and closed his eyes. Mabel lay in the darkness, listening to his breathing even out. This man was her husband now, a stranger who hadn't spoken more than 2 words to her, accused of murder, living like a hermit in the mountains. What the hell had she done? But exhaustion dragged her under before she could find an answer. She woke to the smell of coffee. Morning light filtered through the lean-to's entrance, and Mabel emerged to find Silas tending the fire. A battered tin pot sat on the coals, steam rising from dark liquid inside. He poured some into a cup, chipped ceramic, but clean, and offered it to her. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint, but hot and real. Mabel sipped gratefully. "Thank you," she said. Silas nodded and turned his attention to breakfast. He had something wrapped in leaves, cooking in the coals. Fish, Mabel realized, fresh caught from one of the streams. Simple food, but prepared with care. They ate together as the sun climbed higher, warming the camp. Mabel's body ached from yesterday's hike, and her feet were definitely blistered, but the mountain air was clean and the silence surprisingly peaceful. After breakfast, Silas began his daily routine. He checked his tools, repaired a weak spot in the lean-to's roof, split firewood with methodical precision. Watching him work, Mabel saw what the town had missed. This wasn't a wild man. This was a craftsman maintaining his home. "The trial's in 5 days," Mabel said. "We need to prepare your defense." Silas paused mid-swing, the axe frozen above his head. Then he brought it down hard, splitting the log cleanly. "I know you don't want to talk about it, but if we don't give Judge Morrison something to work with, you'll hang." Another log split. Another. Silas worked with focused intensity, refusing to look at her. "Did Jacob Hendricks come after you?" The axe bit into the stump where Silas was working, stuck fast. He left it there and walked away toward the edge of camp. Mabel followed. "I can't help you if you won't tell me what happened." He stood at the precipice, looking out over the valley. The view was breathtaking, miles of forest and stone stretching to distant peaks. Black Hollow was barely visible, a smudge of smoke and buildings far below. "They found his belongings in your camp," Mabel said quietly. "How did they get here?" Silas's jaw worked, but no words came. "Please, I know talking is hard for you. I know whatever happened up here broke something inside you, but I just married you to save your life, and I'd really like to know if that was a mistake." He turned to face her then, and the raw pain in his eyes nearly stopped her breath. This was a man carrying weight she couldn't imagine, secrets that had driven him into these mountains and kept him here in silence. "I won't judge you," Mabel said. "Whatever happened, whatever you did or didn't do, I just need the truth." Silas stared at her for a long moment. Then he walked back to the fire and pulled something from beneath a pile of stones, a small wooden box carefully made and polished smooth. He opened it. Inside were 3 items: a tintype photograph, faded and creased, a small ring, size for a child's finger, and a carved wooden horse no bigger than Mabel's thumb, every detail precise despite its size. Silas touched the photograph gently, then turned it so Mabel could see. The image showed a younger version of Silas, clean-shaven, well-dressed, standing beside a slender woman holding an infant. 2 children stood in front, a boy and a girl, maybe 5 and 7 years old. The whole family looking at the camera with serious expressions, the way people did for photographs. "Your family?" Mabel asked softly. He nodded. "Where are they?" His hand curled into a fist and he looked away. But Mabel had seen enough death to recognize its shadow. She didn't need him to say it. "I'm sorry," she said. He closed the box carefully and returned it to its hiding place. When he straightened, his shoulders were rigid with tension. "Jacob Hendricks," Mabel prompted gently. "Did he know about them?" A nod. "Did he come here looking for something?" Another nod. "What was he looking for?" Silas walked to the forge built into the mountainside. He pushed aside some tools and revealed a narrow opening barely visible in the rock. From inside, he pulled out a leather bag, heavy with something inside. He dumped the contents at Mabel's feet. Gold. Not a fortune, but substantial. Coins and small nuggets, maybe a few $100s worth. Enough to kill for, certainly. "You found gold in these mountains," Mabel said. Silas shook his head. He pointed to the gold, then to himself, then made hammering motions. "You made this? You're a smith?" "Yes." He pointed to his forge, then shaped his hands as if forming something. "The gold wasn't found. It was payment. For work." "People paid you in gold for metal work?" Another nod. The pieces were starting to fit together. A skilled craftsman living in isolation, taking payment in gold and valuables. Word spreading among travelers and miners. And eventually, someone deciding that gold might be easier to steal than to earn. "Jacob Hendricks heard about your gold and came to take it," Mabel said. Silas's face darkened. He nodded once, sharp and bitter. "What happened when he came?" For a long moment, Silas just stood there. Then he picked up a stick and began drawing in the dirt. A rough map, the camp, the canyon, the paths. He drew 2 figures meeting, drew a struggle. Then he made the motion of someone falling. You fought him? Yes. And he fell accidentally? Silas hesitated. Then he shook his head and drew a third figure, standing above the fallen one. Mabel's heart sank. Someone else was there. Yes. Someone else killed Jacob Hendricks. Silas nodded, his expression bleak. Who? He shook his head violently and erased the drawing with his boot. That was as far as he would go. Silas, if someone else committed the murder, you have to tell the judge. It's your only defense. He looked at her with such fierce determination that she took a step back. Then he made a gesture she didn't understand at first, hands curved as if holding something small and precious, protecting it. You're protecting someone, Mabel said slowly. Someone you care about. His jaw set in a hard line. Yes. More than you care about your own life. Yes. That's noble and stupid, Mabel said flatly. You can't protect anyone if you're dead. Silas turned away, but Mabel grabbed his arm. The muscles tensed under her hand, but he didn't pull away. Listen to me. I've already lost one husband to men who thought they could take what they wanted. I'm not losing another one because you're too damn stubborn to save yourself. If you won't tell me who you're protecting, fine. But we're finding another way to prove your innocence. He looked at her hand on his arm, then at her face. Something shifted in his expression, surprise giving way to something that might have been respect. Can you write? Mabel asked. He nodded. Then write down everything that happened that day. Every detail. I'll read it and figure out what we can use without exposing whoever you're protecting. For a moment, she thought he'd refuse. Then he went to the lean-to and emerged with paper, old, yellowed, but usable, and a pencil worn down to a stub. He sat by the fire and began to write. Mabel busied herself exploring the camp while he worked. The more she saw, the more impressive it became. The forge was cleverly designed to channel heat and smoke. The tools were well maintained, some clearly handmade. A small garden plot tucked into a sunny spot grew herbs and root vegetables. This wasn't the camp of a wild man. This was the refuge of someone who'd been civilized once and chose isolation over whatever he'd left behind. An hour later, Silas handed her 3 pages covered in cramped handwriting. Mabel read them slowly, and with each paragraph, her anger grew. Silas's real name was Rowan Hale. He'd been a master blacksmith in Denver, known for decorative ironwork and fine metal smithing. He'd had a wife, Anna, and 3 children, Emma, Samuel, and baby Grace. 7 years ago, a gang of raiders had attacked their homestead outside Denver while Rowan was away delivering a commission. By the time he returned, his family was dead and his home was ashes. The law did nothing. The raiders moved on, unpunished, and Rowan, broken beyond repair, had fled into the mountains where he wouldn't have to wake up every day in the place where his children had died. He'd taken the name Silas Crow from a gravestone he'd passed, left Rowan Hale buried with his family. For years he'd lived in isolation, occasionally trading metalwork for supplies. Then 3 months ago, Jacob Hendricks had appeared at his camp with another man, someone Silas refused to name. They'd heard about his gold and demanded he hand it over. Silas had refused. Hendricks had attacked him. They'd fought, and Hendricks had fallen during the struggle, hitting his head on a rock. He'd been alive when he fell, stunned but breathing. The unnamed man had picked up Silas's own hammer and finished what the fall had started. Then he told Silas that if he ever spoke about what happened, he'd make sure the world knew Rowan Hale's family had been murdered because of him, that the raiders had been hired by a business rival Rowan had crossed, and that Rowan's pride had gotten his children killed. It was a lie, probably. But Silas couldn't bear the thought of his family's memory being tainted by such a story. So he'd stayed silent, even when the sheriff arrested him, even when they threw him in a cage. Better to hang as Silas Crow the murderer than risk Anna and the children being remembered as casualties of their father's mistakes. Mabel finished reading and looked up to find Silas watching her with hollow eyes. "This man who was with Hendricks," she said carefully. "You're protecting him because he threatened your family's memory." A nod. "But he's the real killer." Another nod. "And you won't give me his name." Silas shook his head firmly. Mabel wanted to shake him, wanted to yell that dead people didn't care about their reputations, that letting a killer walk free didn't honor anyone's memory. But she'd seen grief do strange things to people. She'd seen how loss could twist logic into shapes that made sense only to the person carrying the weight. "All right," she said finally. "We'll work with what we have. Self-defense. You fought Hendricks, he fell and hit his head. You didn't kill him." Silas gestured to this part about the other man finishing the job. "I know, but without naming him, we can't prove someone else delivered the fatal blow. We can argue that Hendricks attacked you, that his death was accidental, that you panicked and ran instead of reporting it." It wasn't a great defense, but it was something. They spent the afternoon preparing. Silas wrote out more details, times, descriptions of the fight, exactly where Hendricks had fallen. Mabel questioned him relentlessly, pushing for specifics that might support their case. "What about witnesses? Anyone who can verify what you were doing that day before Hendricks arrived?" Silas shook his head. "The gold. Where exactly was it when the sheriff searched your camp?" Silas gestured toward the hidden crevice in the rock. "So they didn't find it. They only found Hendricks's belongings." "Yes." The sheriff had assumed the saddlebags and rifle were Silas's motivation for murder. He'd never looked deeper. As the sun began to set, Mabel realized they'd been so focused on the trial that she'd forgotten about the basic practicalities of survival. "I need to go back to town tomorrow," she said. "The land claim Whitmore abandoned. I need to file for it properly. And we'll need supplies if we're going to live out here." Silas looked alarmed. He gestured toward Black Hollow, then made a cutting motion across his throat. "I know it's dangerous, but we can't hide in the mountains forever. After the trial, assuming we win, we'll need a legal homestead, somewhere to build a real life." He stared at her like she was speaking a foreign language. "You didn't think about what comes after," Mabel realized. "You expected to hang, so you never planned beyond it." Silas looked away, uncomfortable. "Well, I'm planning beyond it, and that means claiming land, establishing residency, making this legitimate, which means I need to go to town." He shook his head violently. "Then come with me." Another head shake, more emphatic. "Fine, I'll go alone, but I'm going." Silas grabbed her arm, not hard, but desperate. He pointed to her, then to the mountain, then made a staying motion. "I can take care of myself," Mabel said. "I've been doing it for a long time." He didn't let go. His grip was gentle, but his eyes were fierce, and Mabel suddenly understood. This man had lost everyone he'd ever cared about to violence. He'd watched his family die. He'd seen Jacob Hendricks murdered right in front of him, and now she, the stranger who'd inexplicably married him, wanted to walk back into a hostile town alone. He was terrified. "All right," Mabel said softly. "We'll both go. Tomorrow morning, early, before most people are awake. We file the land claim, buy supplies, and get out fast. Together." The tension in his shoulders eased slightly. He nodded and released her arm. That night they shared the lean-to again. Mabel lay awake, listening to Silas's quiet breathing and thinking about the impossibility of what they were attempting. A fraudulent marriage to save a man accused of murder. A secret that could hang him if revealed. A killer walking free while the innocent stayed silent. And underneath it all, grief so profound it had driven a skilled craftsman into the wilderness to live like a ghost. She'd thought marrying a stranger was the reckless part, but she was beginning to realize that had been the easy decision. Everything that came after, that's where the real gamble lived. They rose before dawn and made the trek back to Black Hollow in tense silence. The town was just waking when they arrived, smoke rising from early fires, shutters opening as shopkeepers prepared for the day. People stopped and stared as Mabel and Silas walked down the main street. Whispers followed them like shadows. The land office was a cramped room attached to the surveyor's building. A clerk with ink-stained fingers looked up as they entered, his eyes widening when he recognized Silas. "Mrs. Crow," Mabel said firmly, using her new name as a shield. "I'm here to file a claim on the property abandoned by Thomas Whitmore." The clerk's gaze darted between her and Silas. "That property's been claimed by someone else." "By whom?" "Mr. Jacob Hendricks filed for it 2 months ago." Mabel's stomach dropped. "Jacob Hendricks is dead." "Yes, ma'am," which means the claim passes to his heir. His brother Marcus Hendricks arrived in town 3 days ago to settle the estate. Of course, because nothing about this situation could be simple. "What's the process for disputing a claim?" Mabel asked. "You'd need to show prior right or prove the original claim was fraudulent. Do you have evidence of either?" She didn't. Thomas Whitmore's abandonment of the property had been clean. He'd sold or given up all his rights before leaving. "I'll need to speak with Marcus Hendricks directly," Mabel said. "He's staying at the hotel, but ma'am," the clerk hesitated. "Given your husband's situation, I'd suggest avoiding Mr. Hendricks. He's not in a forgiving mood." "I'm sure he's not. Thank you for your time." They left the land office and headed for the general store. Mabel needed supplies regardless of where they'd be living, and putting off the confrontation with Marcus Hendricks wouldn't make it easier. The store was run by a thin woman named Mrs. Patterson, who served them with tight-lipped efficiency. Mabel selected carefully: flour, salt, coffee, beans, a few pieces of fabric to repair her clothing. Basic necessities, nothing fancy. Mrs. Patterson tallied the items with obvious reluctance. "That'll be $6. Mabel counted out coins, watching her small reserve of money shrink further. As they were leaving, a voice stopped them. "You're the woman who married him." A man stood in the doorway, blocking their exit. Late 30s, well-dressed, with Jacob Hendricks' square jaw and aggressive stance. Marcus Hendricks, no doubt about it. "I'm Mabel Crow," she said evenly, "and you're in our way." "Your way," Marcus laughed, bitter and sharp. "You married my brother's killer and you think you've got rights in this town?" "I married a man who hasn't been convicted of any crime. The trial's in 4 days. Until then, he's innocent." "He's guilty as hell and everyone knows it. Found with Jacob's belongings, blood on his hands." "There was no blood," Mabel interrupted. "The sheriff's report doesn't mention blood, and being in possession of stolen items isn't the same as murder." Marcus stepped closer, radiating menace. Silas moved between them immediately, his body language shifting from passive to protective. "Call off your dog," Marcus said. "He's my husband, not my dog. And if you threaten me again, you'll see exactly what kind of man you're dealing with." For a moment, the tension hung thick enough to choke on. Then Marcus smiled, cold and calculating. "You want to know what kind of man you married? Ask him about the bones they found around his camp. Ask him about the graves he's been robbing. My brother wasn't his first victim, just the first one people cared about." "That's a lie," Mabel said. "Is it? Have you been to all his little hideaways, checked every cave and crevice? Or are you just taking his word for it? Oh wait, he doesn't talk, does he? Convenient, that." Silas's hands had curled into fists, but he didn't move, didn't react, just stood there like a wall between Mabel and Marcus. "We're leaving," Mabel said. "Step aside." "You're going to watch him hang," Marcus said. "And when he does, you'll know you bet wrong. You'll know you tied yourself to a murderer for nothing." He moved aside, letting them pass, but his words followed them out into the street, loud enough for gathering onlookers to hear. 4 days until justice! 4 days until Silas Crow pays for what he did." Mabel kept walking, her spine straight, refusing to look back. Silas matched her pace, the supplies slung over his shoulder. They were almost to the edge of town when Judge Morrison appeared from the hotel. "Mrs. Crow." "A word, if you please." Mabel stopped. The judge looked every one of his 60-some years in the morning light, his face lined with fatigue and something that might have been regret. "Your Honor, I wanted you to know the trial will be fair. I promise you that. But fair doesn't mean you'll like the outcome. The evidence against your husband is substantial. The evidence is circumstantial. Perhaps, but juries don't always see the distinction, especially when the accused won't speak in his own defense." "He'll speak," Mabel said, hoping it was true. "When it matters, he'll speak." Morrison studied Silas, who stood silent and still. "I hope you're right, Mrs. Crow. I truly do. But hope doesn't override law. Come prepared to prove innocence, not just claim it." He tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Mabel standing in the dusty street with a husband who wouldn't speak and a trial she had no idea how to win. They walked back to the mountains in silence, and Mabel's mind raced with impossible calculations. 4 days to build a defense with no witnesses, no evidence, and a client who refused to name the real killer. 4 days to convince a jury that a silent mountain man was innocent of murder. 4 days to save a stranger she'd married on impulse and somehow started to care about, despite every rational reason not to. The math didn't work in their favor, but Mabel had never been particularly good at accepting impossible odds. Back at the mountain camp, Mabel threw herself into preparation with the kind of focused intensity that had gotten her through Henry's death. When the world collapsed, you either drowned or you swam. She'd learned to swim. Silas sat across the fire, watching her pace and mutter to herself as she worked through possible defense strategies. She'd spread his written account on a flat rock, weighing down the corners with stones, and kept returning to it like she might find new answers in words she'd already read a dozen times. "The problem is Marcus," she said aloud, more to herself than to Silas. "He wants revenge, and the town wants closure. You're giving them both. Unless we can prove someone else was there." She has stopped, struck by a thought. "The other man, the one you won't name. He had to leave tracks, evidence, something that proves a third person was present." Silas shook his head and pointed to the written account. She'd already read that part. The unnamed man had been careful, had worn Jacob's spare boots to confuse the trail, had made sure nothing could trace back to him. What about motive? Why did he want Jacob dead specifically? Was it just about the gold or something else? Silas's jaw tightened. He picked up a stick and drew in the dirt. Two figures facing each other, one much larger than the other. Then he crossed out the smaller figure violently. "He was afraid of Jacob," Mabel said slowly. "Jacob had something on him?" A nod. "What?" Silas threw down the stick and turned away. That was clearly past the line he'd drawn for himself. Mabel wanted to scream with frustration. Every answer led to a wall he wouldn't cross, a secret he'd protect even if it killed him. And it would kill him, she was increasingly certain of that. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if Mabel hadn't been calculating how many more sunsets Silas might see. 4 days until trial. Maybe one more day after that before sentencing and execution. 5 sunsets, give or take. She must have said it aloud because Silas looked at her sharply. Their eyes met across the fire, and for the first time since she'd known him, she saw something other than resignation in his face. Fear. Real, honest fear. He didn't want to die. He'd accepted it, prepared for it, but he didn't want it. "Then help me," Mabel said quietly. "Give me something I can use." Silas stood abruptly and disappeared into the darkness beyond the fire's reach. Mabel heard him moving around, the sound of stone scraping stone. When he returned, he was carrying something wrapped in oiled cloth. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a leather journal. The cover was worn, the pages yellowed, but the handwriting inside was meticulous. Sketches and notes, technical drawings, dates and locations. "Your work journal," Mabel said, taking it carefully. He nodded and flipped to a page dated 3 months earlier. The entry was brief but specific. J. Hendricks. Commission for gate ironwork, paid half in advance. Completion date negotiated for late summer. "Jacob hired you for a job?" "Yes." Silas turned more pages, showing other commissions. Names Mabel recognized from town. Merchants, ranchers, even Sheriff Murphy. For years, Silas had been doing metalwork for half of Black Hollow, and they'd paid him well for it. "So Jacob knew where your camp was because he'd hired you before. He wasn't a stranger." Silas nodded grimly. He flipped to another entry, this one marked with a dark slash of pencil. J. Hendricks. Demands return of advance payment. Claims work unsatisfactory though not yet begun. Threatening legal action. "He tried to get his money back," Mabel said. "Before the work was even done?" Another nod. Silas showed her more entries. Jacob had become increasingly aggressive, demanding not just his advance, but additional compensation for time wasted. When Silas refused, Jacob had threatened to spread rumors about the quality of his work, to poison his reputation among other clients. "He was trying to ruin you," Mabel said. "Why?" Silas turned to the final entry about Jacob. The handwriting here was different, harder, more agitated. J. Hendricks arrived with MH demanded all gold as compensation for damages. When refused, attacked. MH finished what J started. MH. Those initials again, the person Silas wouldn't name. "Marcus Hendricks," Mabel said suddenly. "MH could be Marcus." Silas's face went carefully blank, which was answer enough. "That's who you're protecting? The brother of the man you're accused of killing?" He wouldn't meet her eyes. "Why in hell would you protect Marcus Hendricks?" Silas took the journal back and flipped to a much earlier entry, years before Jacob's death. A sketch of a woman holding an infant, rendered with remarkable skill. Beneath it, a name. Margaret Hendricks and daughter Sarah. "Marcus's wife?" Mabel guessed. A nod. You did work for them? Silas pointed to another sketch. A cradle, beautifully designed with protective symbols worked into the iron. Then another entry. M. Hendricks. Payment for cradle and household items. Wife recently delivered. Requested blessing symbols for protection. The later entries told a darker story. Margaret Hendricks had died in childbirth a year later, second baby stillborn. Marcus had spiraled into gambling and drink. When Silas had tried to collect payment for additional work, Marcus had threatened him, claimed the cradle's blessing symbols had failed to protect his family, demanded his money back. The dispute had escalated until Marcus showed up at Silas's camp with his brother Jacob, both armed and angry. So Marcus killed his own brother, Mabel said. Maybe accidentally during the fight, or maybe on purpose. And he blamed you. Silas's expression confirmed it. And you're staying silent because, what? You feel guilty about Margaret dying? You think you owe Marcus something because his wife is dead? He flinched at her harsh tone, but didn't deny it. That's insane. You didn't kill Margaret. Childbirth is dangerous. Women die. It's not your fault, and it's sure as hell not worth hanging for. Silas grabbed the journal and pointed to the entry about the blessing symbols. His finger stabbed at it repeatedly, and Mabel saw the desperate guilt in his eyes. He'd promised protection. He'd worked symbols into the iron meant to keep the family safe. And when Margaret died anyway, he'd felt like he'd failed, like his work had been a lie. It was irrational, grief-soaked logic, but Mabel recognized it. After Henry died, she'd spent months convinced that if she'd just done something different, walked him to work that morning, convinced him to quit that job, been a better wife, he'd still be alive. Survivor's guilt twisted everything, made you responsible for things you couldn't control. Listen to me, Mabel said firmly. Margaret's death wasn't your fault, and staying silent while Marcus frames you for his brother's murder doesn't honor her memory. It just means two men die instead of one. Silas shook his head stubbornly. Fine. Then we'll prove it without naming him. The journal helps. It establishes that Jacob had reason to come after you, that there was conflict between you. That supports a self-defense claim. She spent the next hour reading through the entire journal, taking notes on anything useful. The picture that emerged was of a skilled craftsman who'd built a quiet life in the mountains, trading his work for survival. Dozens of people had hired him over the years. He'd been reliable, talented, fair in his pricing. And then Jacob Hendricks had decided to destroy him over a petty dispute about payment. We can use this, Mabel said, hope kindling in her chest. This shows you're not some wild killer. You're a tradesman with clients and a reputation. The town knows you. They've been buying from you for years. But even as she said it, she knew the problem. Those same people had thrown him in a cage and called for his death. Whatever business relationships he'd had, they'd evaporated the moment he was accused of murder. Still, it was something. Over the next 2 days, Mabel worked herself to exhaustion. She made another trip to town alone. Silas had tried to stop her, but she'd been adamant, and spoke with every person she could find who'd hired him for metal work. Most refused to talk to her. A few admitted they'd used his services, but quickly added that they'd never trusted him, that they'd always known something was wrong with him. Only Mrs. Chen was honest. His work was beautiful, she said, showing Mabel an iron bracket he'd made for her restaurant sign. Never gave me a moment's trouble. Charged fair prices, delivered on time. But people forget quality when they smell blood. Will you testify to that at the trial? Mrs. Chen hesitated. Testify that I hired a man for metalwork 7 years ago? How does that prove he didn't kill Jacob Hendricks? It proves he's not the monster they're making him out to be. Maybe. Or maybe it proves that monsters can fool people for a long time before they show their true nature. Mrs. Chen's face was sympathetic but firm. I'm sorry, Mrs. Crow. I can't stand up in front of this town and defend him. I have a business to protect. Mabel couldn't argue with that, even though it made her want to put her fist through a wall. The third day before trial, she was back at camp, staring at her notes in frustration, when Silas touched her shoulder. She jumped. He moved so quietly she hadn't heard him approach. He held out his hand. In his palm sat a small carved bird, perfect in every detail despite being no larger than her thumb. Did you make this? Mabel asked. He nodded and pressed it into her hand, closing her fingers around it. Why? He gestured to her notes, then to himself, then made a helpless motion. He was trying to say something, but the words wouldn't come. Mabel looked at the carved bird. The same meticulous craftsmanship as the wooden horse he kept in his treasure box. The same attention to detail. You make these for people you care about, she realized. His cheeks colored slightly, and he looked away. Something warm and complicated bloomed in Mabel's chest. This strange, silent man who'd lost everything and expected nothing had carved something beautiful for her. A gift. A thank you. Maybe even an apology for being so difficult to save. I'm not giving up on you, she said. You know that, right? Even if you've given up on yourself. He met her eyes, and for a moment the walls he'd built came down. She saw exhaustion there, and grief, and something that might have been the beginning of hope. Then he turned away and went back to his evening tasks, gathering firewood, checking the water supply, maintaining the camp with the same steady competence he brought to everything. Mabel tucked the carved bird into her pocket and returned to her notes. The night before the trial, neither of them could sleep. They sat by the fire, not talking, just existing in the same space. Mabel had gone over her defense strategy until the words blurred together. She had Silas's journal, his written account, and a slim argument for self-defense or accidental death. It wasn't enough, but it was all she had. Tomorrow, you have to talk, she said finally. I can present the evidence, but the jury needs to hear from you. They need to see you're human. Silas stared into the flames. I know it's hard. I know whatever broke inside you made words feel impossible. But if you don't speak, they'll hang you. And Her voice caught. I didn't come all this way and marry a stranger just to watch him die without fighting. Why did you? Silas's voice was rough from disuse, barely above a whisper. Mabel startled. It was the first time he'd initiated a conversation, the first question he'd asked. Why did I what? Marry you? A nod. She considered lying, giving him some noble reason. But Silas had been honest with her, as much as his silence allowed. He deserved honesty back, because I watched my first husband die and did nothing. The men who killed him walked free because I was too scared to stand up to them, too worried about what people would think, and I've carried that weight ever since. She pulled the carved bird from her pocket, turning it in her fingers. When I saw you in that cage, I saw a chance to do what I should have done before, to stand up, to fight. Even if I lose, at least I fought. Silas watched her carefully. You think I'm innocent. I know you are. I also know the world doesn't care much about innocence when guilt is more convenient. He was quiet for a long moment, then, I was Rowan Hale once, before. Had a different life. Different name. I know. I read your account. No. He shook his head. You read what happened, not who I was. He paused, struggling with words. I was proud. Arrogant, maybe. Thought my work made me special. Thought I could protect my family with iron and fire and skill. You couldn't have stopped what happened to them. Maybe not. But I wasn't there. I was in Denver, accepting praise for some fancy gate commission, showing off for wealthy clients. While I was preening like a peacock, my family was dying. His hands curled into fists. So I buried Rowan Hale with them. Became someone else. Someone who didn't talk, didn't connect, didn't care. Easier that way. And then I showed up and ruined your plan to die quietly, Mabel said. The corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. Something like that. Well, I'm terrible at leaving well enough alone. Ask anyone in Missouri. This time he did smile, small and brief but real. Then it faded. Tomorrow, when they convict me, if they convict you. When they convict me, he repeated firmly, I need you to take something from my camp, the box with my family's things. Keep it safe. Don't let it end up scattered or sold off. You can keep it safe yourself. Mabel, no, I'm not having this conversation. We're going into that courthouse, we're presenting your defense, and we're walking out together. Then we're going to figure out how to claim that land and build something real. That's the plan. That's not realistic. Realistic is boring. I'm an unrealistic woman who does unrealistic things. She stood up, brushing dirt from her skirt. Get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be hell, and you'll need your strength. She crawled into the lean-to, leaving Silas by the fire. After a moment, she heard him follow. They lay in the darkness, not touching, but aware of each other's presence. Married strangers on the eve of a trial that would likely end in death. Thank you, Silas said quietly. For trying. Thank me when we win. And if we don't? Mabel didn't answer, because if they didn't win, there was no point in thanks or regrets or any of it. There would just be rope and gravity and silence. She fell asleep clutching the carved bird and woke before dawn to find Silas already up, dressed in the cleanest clothes he had. He'd even trimmed his hair and beard with a knife, attempting to look civilized for court. They walked to Black Hollow in the gray pre-dawn light, neither speaking. The weight of what was coming pressed down like a physical thing. The courthouse was just the church with benches rearranged, and Judge Morrison sitting at a makeshift bench in front of the pulpit. By the time Mabel and Silas arrived, the room was already packed. People had come from all over the territory to watch the trial. Entertainment was scarce in the mountains, and a murder case was better than theater. Marcus Hendricks sat in the front row, his face carved from stone. He didn't look at Silas, but his presence radiated threat. Sheriff Murphy sat nearby, ready to testify. The town clerk, Patterson, shuffled papers nervously. And scattered throughout the crowd were all the people who'd hired Silas over the years, who'd benefited from his skill and paid him in gold, now here to watch him hang. Judge Morrison banged his gavel, and the room fell silent. We're here for the trial of Silas Crow, accused of murdering Jacob Hendricks. Mr. Crow, how do you plead? Silas stood. His voice came out stronger than Mabel expected, clear enough to carry. Not guilty. A murmur ran through the crowd. Many had expected him to stay silent, to refuse to participate in his own defense. Morrison nodded. The territory will present its case first. Sheriff Murphy, you're called to testify. Murphy stood and laid out the prosecution's evidence with methodical efficiency. Jacob Hendricks's body found beaten to death in the mountain pass. Silas's camp discovered 5 miles away with Jacob's belongings. The arrest. Silas's refusal to explain or defend himself. And did the defendant show any remorse when you arrested him? Morrison asked. No, Your Honor, didn't speak a word, didn't resist, but didn't seem troubled either, cold as ice. Or in shock, Mabel said, standing before she could stop herself. Morrison raised an eyebrow. Mrs. Crow, you'll have your chance to speak. Sit down. She sat, face burning. The prosecution called 2 more witnesses, men from the search party who'd found the body and later discovered Silas's camp. Their testimony was damning in its simplicity. Dead man here, accused man there, victims' belongings in between. It painted a clear picture of robbery and murder. Then Marcus Hendricks took the stand. My brother was a good man, he said, his voice thick with emotion that might have been real. He ran an honest ranch, helped his neighbors, never hurt anyone. He went up into those mountains to check on his grazing land, and he never came home. And the accused? Morrison prompted. A wild man, a hermit. Everyone knew he was dangerous, but we tolerated him because, Marcus's voice broke convincingly, because we wanted to believe there was still good in him. We were wrong. Mabel's hands clenched in her lap. She knew the truth, that Marcus himself had killed Jacob, that this whole performance was cover for his own guilt. But she couldn't prove it without Silas's cooperation, and Silas sat silent and still beside her. When the prosecution rested, Morrison turned to Mabel. Does the defense wish to present evidence? This was it. Everything she'd prepared for, every argument she'd constructed, came down to this moment. Mabel stood. Your Honor, the defense calls Silas Crow to testify. Another murmur through the crowd. Silas rose slowly, his face unreadable, and took the stand. Mabel's heart hammered as Silas settled into the witness chair. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of every eye in the room boring into him. His hands rested on his knees, and she could see them trembling slightly. State your name for the record, Judge Morrison said. Silas's throat worked. The silence stretched so long Mabel thought he'd frozen completely. Then, Rowan Hale. The courtroom erupted, people shouting questions, demanding to know who Rowan Hale was, why he'd given a false name. Morrison's gavel came down hard 3 times before the noise subsided. Explain that, Morrison ordered. Silas Crow was a name I took from a gravestone 7 years ago, Silas said, his voice gaining strength. Before that, I was Rowan Hale, master blacksmith out of Denver, had a wife and 3 children. Had? Morrison asked. They were killed. Raiders attacked our homestead while I was away on business. When I came back, his voice broke. He stopped, collected himself. There was nothing left to come back to. So I buried Rowan Hale with my family and became someone else. Mabel watched the jury, trying to gauge their reactions. A few faces showed sympathy. Others remained skeptical. Marcus Hendricks had gone pale, she noticed, and was gripping the bench in front of him hard enough that his knuckles showed white. "And why did you come to these mountains?" Morrison continued. "To disappear. To stop being the man who'd failed to protect the people he loved." Silas met the judge's eyes steadily now. "I set up camp, learned to survive on my own, started doing metalwork again because it was the only skill I had. People would find me, ask for commissions. I'd trade work for supplies." "People in this town?" "Yes, Your Honor. Half the iron fixtures in Black Hollow came from my forge. Gates, brackets, tools, household items. I worked for Mrs. Chen, for the Patterson family, for Sheriff Murphy himself." Murphy shifted uncomfortably as people turned to look at him. Mabel stood. "Your Honor, I'd like to enter the defendant's work journal as evidence. It documents years of commissions, including several from the deceased Jacob Hendricks." She brought the journal forward. Morrison examined it, flipping through pages, his expression thoughtful. "This shows Jacob Hendricks hired you for work," Morrison said. "Yes, gate ironwork. He paid half in advance and we agreed on a completion date for late summer." "Then why were you fighting 3 months ago?" This was the dangerous part. Silas had to explain without revealing Marcus's involvement. Mabel held her breath. Jacob changed his mind about the commission, demanded his advance payment back plus extra for what he called damages and wasted time. I refused. The work wasn't finished and our agreement was clear. He threatened to ruin my reputation, to tell everyone my work was shoddy. "Was it?" Morrison asked. "No, Your Honor. You can ask anyone who's hired me. I've never delivered poor work." Morrison looked at Sheriff Murphy. "Is that true?" Murphy looked like he'd swallowed something bitter. "The bracket he made for the jail door still works fine. Never had a problem with it." A few people in the crowd murmured agreement. Mrs. Chen called out, "His work was always solid." "So Jacob Hendricks tried to cheat you out of payment," Morrison summarized. "What happened next?" "He showed up at my camp with—" Silas stopped. Mabel could see him wrestling with it, the instinct to protect Marcus warring with the need to save himself. "With someone else. They demanded I hand over all the gold I'd earned from my commissions, called it compensation. When I refused, Jacob attacked me." "Attacked you how?" "Came at me with his fists. We struggled. He was younger, stronger, but I knew the terrain better. We fought near the edge of a rock shelf and he slipped, hit his head when he fell." "Killing him?" Silas's jaw tightened. "No, he was breathing when he fell. Stunned, but alive." The courtroom went silent. This was new information, different from what the prosecution had claimed. "If he was alive, then how did he die?" Morrison asked. And there it was. The question Silas couldn't answer without exposing Marcus. Mabel watched him struggle, saw the moment he made his decision. "I don't know," Silas said. "I panicked, ran. When I came back later, he was dead." "You came back?" "Yes, to check on him, to see if he needed help. But by then it was too late." It was a weak answer, full of holes, and Morrison knew it. "So you're claiming Jacob Hendricks died from hitting his head, but you have no proof of that? No witness to corroborate your story?" "No, Your Honor." "And the person who came with Jacob, can you name them?" Silas shook his head. "Can't or won't?" "Won't." Morrison leaned back, studying Silas with sharp eyes. "You understand that refusing to identify a potential witness hurts your case?" "Yes." "And you're willing to hang rather than name this person?" Silas glanced at Mabel, and she saw apology in his eyes. Then he looked back at Morrison. "Yes." The judge sighed. "Step down." Mabel wanted to scream. They'd come so close to the truth, and Silas had pulled back at the last moment, but she couldn't give up. Not yet. "Your Honor, I'd like to call Marcus Hendricks to the stand." Morrison raised an eyebrow. "For what purpose?" "To establish his brother's character and business dealings. It was a gamble. Marcus wasn't on trial, and he had no obligation to testify." But Morrison nodded. Very well, Mr. Hendricks, please take the stand. Marcus rose slowly. His face had regained its color, and his expression was carefully neutral as he settled into the witness chair. Mr. Hendricks, did your brother have financial difficulties? Mabel asked. No. Jacob ran a successful ranch. Did he ever mention disputes with the defendant? Not that I recall. Did he ever mention hiring the defendant for metal work? Maybe. Jacob hired a lot of people for various jobs. Mabel pulled out the journal. According to this, your brother paid Silas, Rowan, $50 as an advance for gate work. That's a substantial amount. You're saying he never mentioned it? Marcus shrugged. Like I said, Jacob handled a lot of business. I didn't track every transaction. Where were you 3 months ago when your brother died? Marcus's eyes narrowed. What kind of question is that? A simple one. Where were you? I was in Denver. I have witnesses who can confirm it. Can you name them? My employer, the boarding house where I stayed, several saloon owners. I was there for 2 weeks on business. If he was lying, he'd prepared well. Mabel shifted tactics. Did your brother have enemies? Everyone has enemies, but nobody who'd kill him, except the defendant. Exactly. Mabel was losing ground. She tried one more approach. You arrived in Black Hollow 3 days ago to settle your brother's estate. Why wait 3 months? I didn't hear about his death immediately. Communication's slow in the territories. By the time the news reached Denver and I could arrange travel, it had been weeks. Everything he said was plausible. He'd thought through his story, plugged the holes. Without Silas's cooperation, Mabel had no way to break it. No further question, she said, defeated. Morrison called for closing arguments. The prosecution went first, laying out the simple, damning narrative. Jacob Hendricks, respected rancher, murdered for his belongings. Silas Crow, Rowan Hale, whatever his name, a mountain hermit with his victim's possessions and no credible defense. Then it was Mabel's turn. She stood and faced the jury, 12 men who would decide whether Silas lived or died. She recognized some of them, merchants who'd probably bought Silas's work, farmers who'd passed his camp on hunting trips, townsmen who'd thrown stones at his cage. You've heard the prosecution's version, she began. It's simple and clean, but life isn't simple and the truth is rarely clean. Rowan Hale isn't a monster. He's a man who lost everything, his wife, his children, his entire life, and retreated into these mountains to survive his grief. For 7 years, he lived quietly. He worked with his hands, made beautiful things, traded fairly with people in this town. Many of you benefited from his skill. She paused, letting that sink in. Jacob Hendricks hired him for work, then tried to cheat him. When Rowan refused to be cheated, Jacob came after him with violence. They fought. Jacob fell and hit his head. That's not murder, that's self-defense. And yes, Rowan made mistakes afterward. He panicked. He ran. But fear and poor judgment aren't the same as intentional killing. The prosecution wants you to believe Rowan is dangerous because he's different, because he chose isolation over society, silence over explanation. But being different isn't a crime. And if we hang every man who doesn't fit our expectations, who doesn't talk the way we want or live the way we approve, then we're not delivering justice. We're just feeding our fear. She looked at each juror in turn. I'm asking you to see past the fear, to look at the evidence, or lack of it. The prosecution has shown you stolen property and a dead body. They haven't shown you intent. They haven't shown you premeditation. They haven't proven murder. And in this country, we don't hang people on assumptions. We require proof beyond reasonable doubt. Mabel sat down. It wasn't her best work. She wasn't a lawyer, didn't have the training or the eloquence, but it was honest, and it was all she had. Morrison instructed the jury and sent them to deliberate. The courtroom emptied slowly as people stepped outside to wait. Silas remained seated, his face unreadable. You did well, Mabel said quietly. I doomed myself. You told the truth. That counts for something. Does it? He looked at her with those gray eyes full of resignation. Truth doesn't override convenient narrative. You know that. She did know it, had learned it the hard way when Henry died, and truth became whatever the powerful decided it was. They waited for 2 hours. Mabel paced outside the courthouse while Silas sat on the steps, still and silent. A few townspeople watched them, some hostile, others merely curious. Mrs. Chen brought them water, but said nothing. Finally, the jury returned. Everyone filed back inside. Morrison took his seat, and the foreman, a grizzled rancher named Calloway, stood with a piece of paper in his hands. "Have you reached a verdict?" Morrison asked. "We have, Your Honor." "What say you?" Calloway cleared his throat. "We find the defendant guilty of manslaughter." The courtroom exploded in reaction. Some people shouting for a murder conviction, others arguing manslaughter was right. Morrison's gavel worked overtime restoring order. Mabel's mind raced. Manslaughter, not murder. It meant the jury believed Silas hadn't intended to kill Jacob, but was still responsible for his death. The sentence would be lighter than hanging, but still severe. "Order!" Morrison shouted. When silence finally fell, he addressed the jury. "Explain your reasoning." Calloway looked uncomfortable. "We don't think he planned to kill Jacob Hendricks. The evidence for self-defense is thin, but there's enough doubt about premeditation. Could have been a fight that went wrong. Could have been, like he said, Jacob fell and hit his head. We can't prove murder, but a man's still dead and the defendant was involved. That's manslaughter." Morrison nodded slowly. "The court accepts the verdict. Rowan Hale, stand." Silas stood, swaying slightly. "You've been found guilty of manslaughter in the death of Jacob Hendricks. Sentencing will take place tomorrow morning. Until then, you'll be remanded to Sheriff Murphy's custody. Take him." Murphy moved forward with chains. Silas didn't resist as the sheriff locked them around his wrists, but his eyes found Mabel's across the room. She tried to smile, to show him this wasn't over, but her face wouldn't cooperate. Manslaughter could mean anything from 5 years to life in prison. At Silas's age, after everything he'd been through, either sentence would destroy him. As Murphy led him toward the door, Marcus Hendricks stood. "Your Honor, I'd like to make a statement." Morrison looked annoyed. "This isn't the time. It's about the case. About my brother's death." The judge hesitated, then nodded. "Keep it brief." Marcus stepped forward, and Mabel's instincts screamed warning. Something was wrong. His face had gone pale again, and his hands were shaking. "I lied," Marcus said. The courtroom went silent. "I was there, in the mountains, when Jacob died. I was the other person Rowan Hale wouldn't name." Morrison's gavel hit the bench. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying—" Marcus's voice broke. He looked at Silas, at Mabel, at the crowded room. "I'm saying I killed my brother, not Rowan Hale. Me." Chaos erupted, people shouting, Murphy trying to maintain order, Morrison's gavel slamming repeatedly. Through it all, Silas stood frozen, staring at Marcus with something between horror and disbelief. "Silence!" Morrison roared. When the noise died down, he fixed Marcus with a hard stare. "You're confessing to murder?" "Yes." Marcus seemed to shrink as he spoke. "Jacob and I went to Rowan's camp together. We'd heard he had gold, thought we could take it. Jacob had the idea first, kept talking about it, working himself up. Said Rowan owed him for the commission that went wrong, that we deserved compensation." "And you agreed?" "I was drunk. I'm drunk half the time since Margaret died. Jacob kept pushing, and I just went along with it." Marcus wiped his face. "We got to the camp and demanded the gold. Rowan refused. Jacob attacked him. They fought, and Jacob fell, hit his head just like Rowan said. He was stunned, but alive. Then what happened? I panicked. I thought if Jacob recovered, he'd tell everyone what we'd tried to do. We'd be arrested for attempted robbery. I'd lose everything, so His voice dropped to a whisper. "I picked up Rowan's hammer, and I finished it. I killed Jacob." The silence was absolute. Mabel could hear her own heartbeat, could hear Marcus's ragged breathing. "And you let an innocent man take the blame," Morrison said, his voice cold. "Yes, Rowan saw what I did. I told him if he said anything, I'd spread lies about his family, about how his wife and children died because of him, because of debts or feuds or things he'd done. I'd make sure they were remembered as victims of his failures." Marcus looked at Silas. "I knew it would work. Knew he'd rather die than have their memory tainted." "Why confess now?" Morrison asked. Marcus laughed, bitter and broken. "Because I can't watch another innocent person suffer for what I did. I already killed my brother. I won't kill Rowan Hale too, even if it's just his soul instead of his body." He held out his hands. Arrest me. I'm guilty. Murphy moved forward with the chains, switching them from Silas to Marcus. The courtroom remained eerily quiet as people processed what they'd just witnessed. Morrison looked like he'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes. This trial is suspended pending investigation of new evidence. Rowan Hale, you're released. Marcus Hendricks, you're charged with the murder of Jacob Hendricks. We'll reconvene in 3 days. Murphy led Marcus away, and people began filing out, buzzing with conversation. Mabel just stood there, unable to process what had happened. Silas crossed to her slowly, like a man in a dream. "You saved me," he said. "I didn't do anything." Marcus confessed on his own. "You made him see he couldn't live with it. Your closing argument about fear and assumptions and what we become when we hang people for being different, that reached him." Mabel wasn't so sure about that, but she was too exhausted to argue. "What now?" "Now we go home." "We don't have a home." "Then we build one." They walked out of the courthouse into afternoon sunlight that felt surreal after the darkness of the trial. People stared at them, some apologetic, others still suspicious. But they were free. Against every odd, they were free. Mrs. Chen appeared beside them. "There's something you should know. The Whitmore property. Marcus was lying about Jacob claiming it. I checked the records. It's still unclaimed. If you file today, it's yours." Mabel looked at Silas. "What do you think?" "I think we should claim it. Together." They went to the land office, where the clerk processed the paperwork with trembling hands. By sunset, Mabel and Rowan Hale owned 40 acres of mountain land with a half-ruined cabin and a water source. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. Over the next weeks, while Marcus Hendricks awaited his own trial, Mabel and Silas worked to make the property livable. The cabin needed a new roof, new walls in places, a proper chimney. Silas threw himself into the work with fierce determination, as if building something could fill the holes his confession had opened. Mabel helped where she could, though her skills lay more in planning than execution. She organized their meager supplies, started a proper garden, and began thinking about what came next. They'd need livestock eventually. A larger workshop for Silas's metalwork, contacts in town willing to buy his goods now that his name was clear. One evening, as they sat outside the cabin watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold, Silas broke the silence. "I need to tell you something." Mabel braced herself. "All right. My family, Anna and the children, they were good people, better than I deserved. And when they died, I thought that was the end of anything good in my life. Thought I'd just survive until I didn't anymore, and that would be fine." He turned to look at her. "Then you showed up. Crazy woman who married a stranger to save him from hanging, and you kept pushing, kept fighting, kept refusing to let me give up. You brought me back from being Silas the ghost to being Rowan the person again." "I didn't do that. Marcus's confession did that." "No, you did it. Marcus wouldn't have confessed if you hadn't shown him what real courage looks like. Standing up when everyone tells you to sit down. Fighting when the odds are impossible." He reached for her hand. "I know this marriage was an arrangement, a legal maneuver, but I'd like it to be real, if you're willing." Mabel's throat tightened. This damaged, difficult man was offering her something genuine, something that scared her more than facing down an angry town. "I'm willing," she said, "but you need to know, I'm not easy to live with. I'm stubborn and argumentative, and I have opinions about everything. I've noticed. And I'm not," she gestured at herself, "I'm not the kind of woman men usually choose." Silas frowned. "What does that mean?" "I'm plain. I'm heavy. I'm past my prime. Men don't write songs about women like me." "Good. I don't want a woman from a song. I want a partner who'll call me on my mistakes and won't let me hide when things get hard. I want someone real." He squeezed her hand. "I want you, if you'll have me." Mabel felt tears prickling her eyes, which was ridiculous. She'd cried more in the last month than in the previous 5 years combined. But this was different. Not grief or fear, but something sweeter and more complicated. "Yes," she said. "I'll have you." They sat together as night fell, two broken people who'd found each other by accident and decided to stay on purpose. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. They still had hard times ahead. Winter coming, money tight, a community that would take time to trust them again. But they had land, they had skills, and they had each other. For two people who'd expected to die alone, that felt like more than enough. The next morning, Silas started working on something new. Not repairs to the cabin or tools for survival, but something else. Mabel watched him sketch designs, heat metal in a portable forge he'd built, shape and hammer with focused intensity. 3 days later, he presented her with a wedding ring. Not the gold band from her mother that he still wore on his pinky. This was iron, forged from scratch, worked into a simple band with delicate leaves etched around the outside. Beautiful in its simplicity, perfect in its imperfection. "I know it's not gold," Silas said, suddenly uncertain. "But iron lasts, iron endures, and I wanted you to have something I made specifically for you." Mabel slipped it onto her finger. It fit perfectly, the metal already warm from Silas's hands. "It's better than gold." They'd been married once by necessity, words spoken in front of a hostile crowd. But that evening, they married again by choice, exchanging promises with only the mountains as witness. No judge, no spectators, no cage or chains or fear. Just two people who'd survived the worst the world could throw at them and decided to face whatever came next together. Mabel looked at the ring on her finger and then at the man who'd made it. Rowan Hale, formerly Silas Crow, formerly a ghost living in caves. Now her husband in truth as well as law. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That I came to Colorado for one life and found a completely different one, and I wouldn't change it for anything." Silas smiled, a real smile, full and genuine. "Neither would I." The first real test of their new life came 6 weeks later, when winter arrived early and vicious. Mabel woke one morning to find 3 inches of snow covering everything and more falling fast. The cabin's new roof held, but barely. Wind screamed through gaps in the walls they hadn't finished sealing. The temperature inside felt only marginally warmer than outside. "We're not ready for this," she said, watching Silas bank the fire higher. "No," he agreed, "but we'll manage." Managing meant burning through their firewood faster than planned. It meant melting snow for water when the creek froze solid. It meant huddling together at night for warmth, their breath visible even inside the cabin. On the 4th day of the storm, part of the roof gave way. Mabel woke to freezing water dripping onto her face. She sat up with a gasp, and Silas was already moving, dragging their bedding away from the leak. Snow sifted through the gap where shingles had blown free. "Can you fix it?" Mabel asked, though she knew the answer. Nobody could work on a roof in this weather. "Not until the storm breaks." Silas repositioned their sleeping area to the driest corner. "We'll make do." But making do got harder. Their food supplies were running lower than Mabel had calculated. The cold made everything take longer, gathering firewood, melting snow, just moving around. And the isolation pressed down like a weight. Days passed where they saw nothing but white in every direction, heard nothing but wind. On the 10th day, Mabel developed a cough. She tried to hide it at first, not wanting to worry Silas, but by evening she was shivering despite the fire, her chest tight and painful. Silas felt her forehead and swore quietly. "You're burning up." "It's just a cold." "It's not just a cold." He wrapped her in every blanket they had. "You need medicine, real medicine, not mountain remedies." "We can't go to town in this weather." "I can." "Absolutely not, you'll die out there." Silas's jaw set in that stubborn line she'd come to recognize. "I've survived worse winters than this. I know the trails." "In a blizzard?" "Silas, be reasonable. I'm not losing you." His voice went rough. "I've lost everyone I ever cared about. I'm not losing you too." They argued for an hour, but Mabel's fever made it hard to think clearly, and eventually exhaustion won over stubbornness. She fell into restless sleep and woke to find Silas gone, a note left by the fire. "Gone for supplies. Back by tomorrow night. Keep the fire going. Don't die while I'm gone." Mabel wanted to scream at his recklessness, but she was too weak. She fed the fire with shaking hands and tried not to think about Silas struggling through snowdrifts, alone in the killing cold. He returned 30 hours later, half frozen and carrying a pack full of supplies. Medicine from Mrs. Chen, food, proper wool blankets. He'd also brought news. Marcus Hendricks had been sentenced to 15 years in the territorial prison, and the town was slowly beginning to accept that they'd nearly hanged an innocent man. "People asked about you," Silas said, brewing tea with the herbs Mrs. Chen had sent. "Asked if you were all right, if we needed help." "What did you tell them?" That we're managing, that we're building something real up here. He pressed the hot cup into her hands. Drink this. All of it. The medicine tasted bitter, but it worked. Within 2 days, Mabel's fever broke. Within a week, her cough subsided. By the time the storm finally cleared, she was weak but recovering. The damage to their homestead was substantial. The roof needed complete repair. Their woodpile was depleted. The garden plot was buried under 2 feet of snow. Looking at it all, Mabel felt despair creeping in. "We can't do this alone," she said. "Not and survive." Silas looked at her, then at the ruined roof, then back. "Then we don't do it alone." 3 days later, he rode down to Black Hollow. They'd bought an old horse with the last of their money and returned with Mrs. Chen, her 2 nephews, and a wagon full of supplies. "You helped me when I first came to this country," Mrs. Chen said, directing her nephews to start on the roof. "Nobody else would rent to a Chinese woman. You stood up to the town council when they tried to run me out. I don't forget debts." Mabel hadn't known that. Hadn't known she'd made any impression on Mrs. Chen beyond being the crazy woman who married a murderer. Over the next week, people trickled up from town. The blacksmith brought metal for repairs, remembering the quality of Silas's work. Patterson the clerk came with his sons, saying quietly that he'd always thought the trial was wrong. Even Sheriff Murphy appeared, awkward and gruff, helping to reinforce the cabin's walls. "I should have investigated better," Murphy admitted during a break. "Should have questioned the evidence instead of accepting the easy answer. For what it's worth, I'm sorry." Silas just nodded, but Mabel saw something ease in his shoulders. Forgiveness, maybe. Or at least the beginning of it. By the time everyone left, the cabin was weather-tight, the woodpile was restocked, and the Hales had more supplies than they'd started with. More than that, they had something Mabel hadn't expected: community. People who'd seen them survive the impossible and decided they were worth helping. Winter softened into spring, and with it came new challenges. The land needed clearing for proper farming. They needed livestock, chickens at minimum, maybe a cow if they could afford it. Silas's metalwork brought in some money, but not enough. They were surviving, but barely. Then in early April, a stranger appeared at their door. He was elderly, well-dressed in Eastern style, with a neat beard and eyes that took in everything. "I'm looking for Rowan Hale," he said. Silas stepped forward warily. "I'm Rowan Hale. My name is Theodore Ashford. I own a metalworks company in Boston. I heard about your trial, about your past work in Denver. I've seen some of your pieces, the decorative gate at the Morrison Hotel, the ironwork at the church. Remarkable craftsmanship." "What do you want?" Silas asked. "To offer you a commission. I'm building a new estate in Colorado Springs. I need someone who can create custom ironwork, gates, railings, light fixtures, decorative pieces throughout. The job would take 6 months, maybe more. It would pay $3,000. Mabel's breath caught. $3,000 was more than most people saw in 5 years. "That's too much," Silas said immediately. Ashford smiled. "It's what the work is worth. I've hired metal workers from New York, from London. None of them have your eye for detail, your sense of proportion. I'm willing to pay for quality." "Why come all the way out here?" Mabel asked. "There are craftsmen in Denver, in Springs itself." "Because I want the best, and from what I've seen, Rowan Hale is the best." Ashford pulled out a contract. "Think it over, but I need an answer within the week." After he left, Mabel and Silas sat in stunned silence. $3,000, Mabel finally said. "We could build a proper house, buy livestock, set ourselves up for years. It would mean leaving for 6 months, living in Colorado Springs away from here. Together, though, we'd go together." Silas looked around their rough cabin, at the land they'd worked so hard to make livable. "What about the homestead?" "Mrs. Chen would look after it, or we could hire someone to maintain it while we're gone." Mabel took his hand. "This is the opportunity you've been waiting for. The chance to be Rowan Hale the master craftsman again, not just the hermit who got lucky." "I'm not sure I want to be that person." "Why not?" "Because that person was arrogant, thought his work made him special, made him better than regular people. That person got his family killed." There it was, the guilt he still carried like a stone in his chest. Mabel had seen it surface before, but never this directly. "Your family didn't die because of who you were," she said firmly. "They died because evil men chose violence. That's not on you." I wasn't there to protect them. You couldn't have known, couldn't have predicted it. You're not responsible for other people's cruelty, Silas, Rowan. You're only responsible for what you do with the life you have left. He was quiet for a long time, then, what do you think I should do? I think you should take the job. Not because of the money, though that matters, but because hiding your talent doesn't honor your family's memory. Living small doesn't make their deaths mean something. Creating beauty in an ugly world, that honors them. That says their father was a man worth knowing. Silas pulled the wooden box from its hiding place and opened it. The tintype photograph of Anna and the children stared up at them, frozen in a moment before tragedy. What would they want? Mabel asked gently. For me to be happy, to live fully. His voice cracked. Anna used to say I was born to create things. That working metal was like breathing for me. I think she'd want me to do this. Then we'll do it. They left for Colorado Springs in late April, with Mrs. Chen's promise to watch the homestead and a contract signed in Silas's careful handwriting. The journey took 3 days, and Colorado Springs itself was overwhelming after months of isolation. Buildings, people, noise, the constant movement of civilization. Ashford's estate was on the outskirts, a massive structure rising from cleared land. The scope of the project took Silas's breath away. Miles of iron fencing, dozens of gates, hundreds of decorative pieces. It was easily the largest commission he'd ever attempted. Can you do it? Ashford asked. Silas walked the property, his mind already working. Mabel watched him transform before her eyes, the hesitant hermit falling away, replaced by the confident craftsman. He asked questions about materials, about design preferences, about timeline. His hands moved as he talked, sketching shapes in the air. Yes, he said finally, I can do it. They rented a small house in town, and Silas threw himself into the work. He set up a forge in Ashford's workshop, hired 2 apprentices to help with basic tasks, and began creating pieces that drew crowds. People would stop to watch him work, mesmerized by the way he shaped metal into leaves and vines, into geometric patterns that seemed to shift and flow. Word spread. Other wealthy residents approached Silas with their own commissions. Before long, he had more work than he could handle. You need to expand, Mabel said one evening, reviewing their finances. They'd earned enough in 3 months to pay off their debts and still have money left over. Hire more apprentices. Maybe even open a proper shop. That's not the plan. The plan is to finish this job and go home. What if home could be more than a cabin in the mountains? What if we could build something bigger? Silas set down his tools. You want to stay in Colorado Springs? I want to stop just surviving and start actually living. We could have a real business here. You could train apprentices, pass on your skills. We could build a house, maybe even start a family. She stopped, suddenly uncertain. They'd never discussed children. You'd want that? Silas asked quietly. After everything I've lost, knowing the risk? Life is risk. Love is risk. I've already lost 1 husband to violence. If I let fear stop me from building a future with you, then those men who killed Henry win. The raiders who killed your family win, and I'm tired of letting the worst parts of the world dictate how we live. Silas pulled her close, and Mabel felt his heart beating against her cheek. All right, he said. We'll build something. Something real and lasting, together. The Ashford Commission took 8 months instead of 6. Silas insisted on perfection, on details so fine they could barely be seen. When it was finished, people traveled from Denver just to see it. Newspapers wrote about the mountain craftsmen who survived injustice to create beauty. Commissions flooded in. By the time they returned to their homestead in December, everything had changed. They had money, real money, enough to expand the cabin into a proper house. They had business contacts, people who wanted Silas's work and were willing to pay for it. And they had a decision to make. We could move to Colorado Springs permanently, Mabel said, standing in their old cabin. It felt small now, cramped after months in town. Set up a real workshop, build a business. Or we could stay here and build something different, Silas countered. Use this land, create a home that's ours, not just a place we live. They argued about it for weeks, neither willing to concede. Finally, Mrs. Chen suggested a compromise. Keep both. Use the homestead in summer, work in Colorado Springs in winter. You get the best of both. Isolation when you need it, community when you want it. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was workable. They built a workshop on the homestead property, large enough for Silas to handle small commissions. They bought a small building in Colorado Springs to use as a shop and living quarters during winter months. They hired 2 permanent apprentices and seasonal help as needed. By their second anniversary, the real one, not the desperate marriage in front of a hostile crowd, they'd built something neither had imagined possible. A business that supported them comfortably, a home that felt safe, a life that had room for both work and rest, for solitude and community. But the biggest change came on a frozen February morning when Mabel woke feeling nauseated. She knew immediately, even before her monthly bleeding failed to arrive. She'd been pregnant once before, years ago with Henry, but had lost the baby at 3 months. The memory of that loss made her hesitant to say anything to Silas. But he noticed. He always noticed. "What's wrong?" he asked, finding her pale and shaking over the wash basin. "I think—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed immediately by fear. "Are you certain?" "Not yet, but probably." He pulled her into his arms, and she felt him trembling. "What do you need?" he asked. "I need you not to be terrified." "Can't promise that, but I can promise to be here, whatever happens." They told no one for the first 3 months. Mabel worked through morning sickness and exhaustion, terrified every day that she'd lose this baby, like she'd lost the first. Silas hovered constantly, driving her crazy with his protectiveness. "I'm pregnant, not dying," she snapped one day when he tried to stop her from lifting a basket of laundry. "You're carrying my child. I'm allowed to worry. Worry quietly and from farther away." But as the pregnancy progressed and held, Mabel's fear began to shift toward hope. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe they could have this. In June, during a particularly hot spell, Mabel went into labor. It lasted 14 hours. Brutal, exhausting hours where she cursed Silas's name and swore she'd never go through this again. Mrs. Chen attended her, calm and competent, while Silas paced outside like a caged animal. Finally, as sunset painted the mountains gold, a baby's cry split the air. "It's a girl," Mrs. Chen announced, wrapping the infant in clean cloth, healthy and loud. Silas burst into the room, his face wild with hope and terror. Mrs. Chen placed the baby in his arms, and Mabel watched him break apart and rebuild himself in the space of a heartbeat. "She's perfect," he whispered. "She's wrinkly and covered in fluid," Mabel said, exhausted but unable to stop smiling. "But yes, she's perfect." They named her Anna Rose. Anna for Silas's first wife, Rose for Mabel's mother. It felt right, honoring the past while building toward the future. The first months were chaos. Anna Rose didn't sleep, cried constantly, and required every ounce of attention they could give. Mabel and Silas stumbled through it together, learning as they went, making mistakes and fixing them, surviving on coffee and determination. But watching Silas with his daughter healed something in him that Mabel hadn't known how to reach. She'd catch him holding Anna Rose, whispering to her about her siblings in heaven, about her mother Anna, who would have loved her, working through his grief in real time, letting himself feel both the old loss and the new love. One night, when Anna Rose was 6 months old and finally sleeping through the night, Silas found Mabel on the porch. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "How far we've come. From a cage in Black Hollow to this." She gestured at their expanded house, the workshop, the land they'd cultivated. "Sometimes it doesn't feel real." "It's real. We built it." "We did, didn't we?" Mabel leaned against him. The town outcast and the abandoned bride. The master craftsman and the woman too stubborn to let him give up. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the mountain wind and the distant call of night birds. Inside, their daughter slept safely. Around them, the life they'd fought for breathed and grew. "I got a letter from Missouri," Mabel said eventually. "They finally convicted the last of Henry's killers. The trial took 3 years, but they got him." "How do you feel about that?" "Relieved. Angry it took so long. Sad that it doesn't bring Henry back." She paused. "But mostly grateful. Because if Henry hadn't died, I wouldn't have left Missouri. Wouldn't have answered Thomas Whitmore's mail-order bride advertisement. Wouldn't have ended up in Black Hollow on the exact day you needed someone crazy enough to marry a stranger." "You think it was meant to be?" "I think terrible things happen, and we can either let them destroy us or we can build something new from the rubble. We chose to build. Silas was quiet, considering. Then, Marcus Hendricks wrote to me from prison. Mabel sat up straight. What did he say? That he's sorry. That watching me nearly hang for his crime broke something in him, made him see what he'd become. He's been sober for 8 months now, working in the prison workshop. Says he thinks about Margaret every day, about how disappointed she'd be in the man he became after she died. Are you going to write back? I don't know. Part of me wants to tell him to rot in hell, but another part remembers what grief did to me, how it twisted me into Silas the ghost. He made terrible choices, but I understand how he got there. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting what he did. No. But maybe it means acknowledging he's human. That people can change, can choose to be better, even after they've been their worst. It was a generous view, more generous than Mabel felt capable of. But watching Silas wrestle with it, she saw the growth in him. The man who'd sat silent in a cage ready to die rather than defend himself was gone. In his place was someone who'd learned to speak, to fight, to hope. 2 years after Anna Rose was born, they had a son. They named him Henry Rowan, and Silas cried when he held him for the first time. I never thought I'd have this again, he said. A family, children, a reason to wake up and build and plan for tomorrow. You have it, Mabel assured him. We have it, together. Their business continued to grow. Silas took on a third apprentice, a young black man from Denver, who showed remarkable talent with decorative work. People raised eyebrows. Hiring a black apprentice in 1870s Colorado wasn't common, but Silas just shrugged. Talent is talent. I don't care what color it comes in. It was the same principle that had driven Mabel to marry him despite the town's horror. The same refusal to let other people's prejudices dictate their choices. By the time Anna Rose was 5 and Henry was 3, the Hale family had become a fixture in both Black Hollow and Colorado Springs. People knew them as the craftsman and his wife, who'd survived a murder trial and built an empire from nothing. The children ran wild and free, learning metalwork from their father and practical business sense from their mother. Judge Morrison, now retired, stopped by one afternoon while Silas was teaching Anna Rose to work the bellows. I wanted to apologize, he said without preamble, for letting that trial get as far as it did. I should have seen the holes in the prosecution's case earlier. You made it right in the end, Silas said. Did I? An innocent man spent weeks in a cage. A town nearly committed judicial murder. Making it right would have been preventing it in the first place. Mabel, listening from the doorway, spoke up. You're human. Humans make mistakes. What matters is that when you saw the truth, you accepted it. A lot of people wouldn't have. Morrison smiled sadly. Your wife's more forgiving than I deserve. She usually is, Silas agreed. After the judge left, Mabel found Silas in the workshop, staring at a half-finished gate. You're thinking about the cage, she said. How can you tell? Because I know you. What are you thinking specifically? That if you hadn't shown up that day, I'd be dead. Marcus would still be free, carrying his guilt but unpunished. And Anna Rose and Henry would never have existed. One choice, one crazy, reckless choice by a stranger, changed everything. One choice changed everything for both of us, Mabel corrected. I chose to speak up. You chose to accept my help. Marcus chose to confess. Mrs. Chen chose to support us. Every person who helped us rebuild made a choice. That's how the world changes, one decision at a time. Silas set down his tools and pulled her close. Thank you, he said. For what? For being stubborn, for refusing to let me give up, for seeing something worth saving when everyone else saw a monster. I saw a man who was tired, Mabel said, and I knew what that felt like. They stood together in the workshop, surrounded by the tools of Silas's trade and the life they'd built. Outside, their children played in the afternoon sun. The mountains stood eternal and indifferent, the same peaks that had witnessed Silas's despair and their unlikely salvation. Years later, when people asked Mabel why she'd married a stranger in a cage, she never gave the same answer twice. Sometimes she said it was desperation, a mail-order bride with no money and no options. Sometimes she said it was instinct, a gut feeling that couldn't be explained. Sometimes she said it was anger at injustice, refusing to watch history repeat itself. All of those answers were true, None of them were complete. The real truth was simpler and more complicated than any single explanation could capture. She'd married Silas because in that moment, standing in front of a hostile crowd, she'd made a choice to be brave instead of safe, to act instead of accepting, to fight instead of surrendering to how things were. And Silas had chosen to accept her help, to trust a stranger, to speak when silence had been his shield for years. Two broken people making choices that terrified them, building something neither could have created alone. That was the real story. Not romance or destiny or divine intervention, just two humans deciding they deserved better than the hand they'd been dealt, and working themselves raw to make it happen. On their 10th anniversary, counting from the cage marriage, not the real vows exchanged in the mountains, Mabel and Silas threw a party. Half of Black Hollow showed up, along with clients from Colorado Springs and Denver, former apprentices who'd become masters in their own right, and even a few people who testified against Silas at his trial. Mrs. Chen brought enough food to feed an army. Sheriff Murphy, gray-haired now and close to retirement, made an awkward toast about being wrong and learning to see past first impressions. Judge Morrison sent a letter from back east, wishing them continued happiness. And as the sun set and people danced in the yard to fiddle music, Anna Rose asked her mother a question. "Mama, did you really marry Papa when he was in a cage?" "I did." "Why?" Mabel looked across the yard to where Silas was teaching Henry how to hold a hammer properly. Her husband, once so broken he couldn't speak, now surrounded by family and community and purpose. "Because sometimes the right thing looks crazy to everyone else," she said. "And you have to do it anyway. Even when you're scared. Especially when you're scared. Being brave doesn't mean not being afraid. It means being afraid and doing the thing anyway." Anna Rose considered this seriously. "I'm going to be brave like you when I grow up." "You already are, sweetheart. You already are." As night fell and stars emerged over the mountains, Mabel stood with Silas on the porch of the house they'd built together. Their children slept inside. Their business thrived. Their life, built from desperation and determination, had become something neither could have imagined in those dark days when everything seemed lost. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't stopped that day?" Mabel asked. "If I'd just walked past the cage?" "Every day," Silas admitted. "I'd be dead, and Marcus would still be lying about what happened. But you did stop. You did stand up. That's what matters." "We stood up together." "Yeah, we did." They stayed there on the porch long after the guests departed, watching the mountains turn purple in the dusk. Two people who'd survived the worst the world could offer and built something beautiful from the ashes. The abandoned bride and the caged man, finding each other in the exact moment both needed saving. Building a life that proved love doesn't have to be perfect to be real, that broken people can heal together, and that sometimes the hardest thing and the right thing are exactly the same. And in the quiet of that mountain evening, with everything they'd fought for surrounding them, Mabel and Silas Hale knew they'd chosen well.